All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fourth session of Afro-Asian Exchanges, the webinar series of the Center for Asian Studies in Africa at the University of Pretoria, or CASA for short. My name is Alf Nilsson, and I'm the director of CASA. I also work as a professor in the Department of Sociology here at the University of Pretoria. As some of you might already know, CASA is a new initiative at the University of Pretoria, launched late last year, that is intended to work as a key hub of research in the field of Asian studies and the study of Afro-Asian connections in South Africa and on the African continent more generally. CASA is currently in its first year of substantial activity, and much of our current efforts gravitate around building relationships and fostering conversations between scholars in and off the Asian and African continents across research fields related to global challenges such as inequality and human development, democracy and human rights, and sustainability and environmental justice. Today, we are honored at CASA and as part of this webinar series to host Professor Ching Kwan Lee from the Department of Sociology at the University of California, Los Angeles. Many of you will be familiar with her pioneering work on China's changing political economy, in which CK has demonstrated time and again the extent to which she is a masterful practitioner of the global ethnographic method as a tool for rigorous conjunctural analysis. CK is the author of several award-winning monographs, including Gender and the South China Miracle from 1998, Against the Law, Labor Protests in China's Rust Belt and Sun Belt from 2007, and The Specter of Global China, Politics, Labor, and Foreign Investments in Africa, which came out in 2017. Between them, these three books, all of which I wholeheartedly recommend, constitute a trilogy of Chinese capitalism crafted through the lens of labor and working class experiences. More recently, her work has focused on Hong Kong studies. In 2019, she co-edited the collection Take Back Our Future, an eventful sociology of the Hong Kong umbrella movement, which unveils the causes, processes, and implications of the 2014 occupation movement in Hong Kong, known as the umbrella movement. The book has been rightly praised as a definite statement on one of the 21st century's most spectacular moments of social unrest. Today, though, CK is joining us to discuss her most recent book, which also draws on her research in the field of Hong Kong studies. Entitled Hong Kong, Global China's Restive Frontier, the book was published in the Cambridge Element series Global China in September last year. In this book, CK asks how, in recent decades, Hong Kong has come to transform itself from a shopper's and capitalist paradise into a city of protests at the front line of a global anti-China backlash. In exploring this question, she situates the post-1997 China-Hong Kong contestation in the broader context of China's global expansionism, effected through a bundle of power mechanisms: economic statecraft, patron clientelism, and symbolic domination, which is deployed around the world, including in Hong Kong. The book also tells us how this power project triggers a variety of counter-movements, ranging from acquiescence and adaptation to appropriation and resistance. In Hong Kong specifically, CK's book brings out how reactions against the totality of Chinese power have taken the form of eventful protests, which over 2 decades have broadened into a momentous decolonization struggle. And what the book ultimately reveals then is how the Hong Kong story, stunning and singular in its many peculiarities, offers lessons about China as a global force. I also want to add that this very important book is available open access from Cambridge. And if you haven't done so already, you should do what I've done, which is to get my hands on a soft copy of the book as soon as possible. It's a fantastic read. And we have, or if we haven't already, we will post a link to the book's webpage where you can download the soft copy from in the chat box. All right, housekeeping for our webinars is fairly simple. CK will speak for about 45 minutes, followed by 10 minutes of comments, which they will be courtesy me. After a brief response from CK, we'll open up for comments and questions from the audience, which can be either put using the mic, turning on your camera if you're comfortable with that, or simply in the chat box, and we'll do our best to read it out. So on that note, welcome CK, and over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Alf. I'm really happy to be able to join this series of seminars and just to be able to congratulate Alf again on the launch of this absolutely essential center, CASA. Let me share screen. I'm not, okay. Great. Oops. Give me a second. I need to. Okay. So Hong Kong. I think Alf in his introduction actually has summarized the book for me pretty well, so that I don't need to set the stage, but I still need to provide some background. And I actually, because I don't know in this audience how many people know what about Hong Kong, to what degree, and so it's kind of difficult to give a talk when you don't know your audience. But I think it also has its advantage. I think I need to convince people why you have to care about Hong Kong if you're not from there like me. I was born and raised in Hong Kong, so naturally I'm interested in my own city of birth. But it's just a city of 7.5 million. Why would the rest of the world care about what happens to the city? And I think it's good practice for me to try to convince people outside of Hong Kong that they need to care about it. And for academics, you know, and for any area specialist, we have this challenge of justifying in intellectual terms the significance of that corner of the world that we are so obsessed with, but for the rest of the world, just one corner, no matter how big that corner is. So that's what I think I want to do here. It's not so much to go into the details of Hong Kong's struggle and its relation with China, which of course I would be happy to in the discussion. But I also like to use this opportunity to get some big ideas across and get some feedback from you, because I'm still writing, in the middle of writing a much longer monograph and taking a much longer historical perspective about Hong Kong's colonial experience and its decolonization struggle, which I would try to argue is quite unique. So let me start by reminding ourselves what has happened in Hong Kong. So I've left Hong Kong I left Hong Kong around 1997, 1 or 2 years after that. And I've been teaching in the US, studying China. So Hong Kong to me is a place where I visited frequently every year, as much as possible, to see my family, my parents, my brothers, my friends. And I never really studied it. I actually spent some years, as some of you may know, in Zambia, studying Chinese investment in Zambia. And that's the Specter of Global China book. And after I was done with that book, it came out 2017, I got this wonderful opportunity to spend some time trying out a faculty position in Hong Kong in one of the local universities. And so I packed my bag and arrived in Hong Kong on June 16, 2019. And that these pictures show what happened that day. During the day and during nighttime. And you see the same wave of humanity pouring to the street, because on that day, 2 million people out of a population of 7.5 million, 2 million people went on the street to protest against the government's bill. And that was, we don't need to go into detail of that, but that was just an example of authoritarianism imposed from Beijing. It was a a bill that would serve Beijing's interest to expand Beijing's power into our judicial system. But anyway, that was how I began my stint in Hong Kong as a faculty. And since then, I couldn't let it go. I have to understand what had happened, what had brought my city, my fellow citizens to the street, and what had happened to bring Hong Kong to this, to change Hong Kong from a shopper's paradise, capitalist paradise, into a city of protest, of historic, world historic proportion and importance. By all accounts, if you calculate the ratio of protesters to the total population, the 2019 protest in Hong Kong was one of the most participatory movement in human history, in record, modern history record. And so this is something that as sociologists from the city, I need to understand. And what happened was peaceful protest of 2 million people quickly turned into very violent, confrontational clashes between citizens and the authorities. Particularly, the world media was focused on this guy, people like him. He's 12, 13, perhaps at most 15 years old, and on the street during my research. I encountered so many people of his age whose first political experience were throwing petrol bomb at the police, standing in the front line, taking in all the chemicals that were sprayed on them from water cannons. And this is from my alma mater, a local university, where students were fighting police like in a war zone. And that was the intensity of that, of the 2019 protest that had dragged on for 6 months. And this is it's almost daily, or weekly, where you see police opening fire and tear gas at crowds with umbrellas again. And I was in many of these actually, and I saw how intensely and committed both sides were fighting at each other. And of course, 1 year later, 2020, Beijing imposed national security law, and it totally changed the city from a global city of liberty and global finance into a much, much more Chinese city now under even more tight control than any Chinese city in mainland China. Now that will be another story, but this is the storyline, the brief summary of just to remind ourselves what has happened in the past few years. Okay, so the Hong Kong-China story is of course much longer and larger than 2019. 2019 was just the epitome of I would say, 2-decade struggle between these two places. And most account, especially in the media, and even academic account by political scientists, look at the story as one of political resistance within one country. And most people don't think of it as anything beyond Hong Kong and Beijing. And it is in this telling within one country framework, it is a struggle between a liberal global financial hub versus its communist authoritarian sovereign. After all, Hong Kong is part of China in a very official and internationally recognized way, cemented by the treaty signed between Britain and China in 1984. And that was the foundation. There was an international treaty guaranteeing Hong Kong 50 years of capitalist liberty, rule of law system. And after 50 years, who knows what will happen. But that was at least an international treaty. Now, what I like to suggest to people who don't really care about Hong Kong or China is that we need to understand this Hong Kong-China story, because it's not just about what happens within one country. And it's not just about a political confrontation between two authorities or two societies. It is actually what happened to Hong Kong is the frontier of global China. If we study Hong Kong and what has happened in Hong Kong in the past 2 decades and more, we'll come to understand the mechanism, the methods by which China expand and project its power globally. Hong Kong is the frontier, and that's why the title of that short book that Alf mentioned is the frontier of a much larger global force. I call it Global China. And that Global China force, that force of Global China, is not just about how China tries to dominate the world, which I'll come to in a minute, but it's also about a backlash. It has triggered a backlash against Global China. And so Hong Kong's resistance in 2019 and all the movements that came before 2019 should be looked at as one big movement, but that big movement is part of an even bigger global phenomenon, global process of resisting, or at least trying to curb the expansion of this global force, Global China. So the point is that I want to make in that book, and I hope that is the hook for people to care about Hong Kong and China, even though you're not from there, even though you don't study that part of the world, is that it is a very important story about a bigger story. It's almost like a prism through which you can analyze Global China and its discontent. And I think it's particularly startling and hopefully more convincing if I say the analysis that I presented in that book is applicable to Hong Kong as much as to Zambia, where I spent time studying, and to Africa more generally. And so for this audience who may be either interested in Asia, Southeast Asia as the backyard of Global China, or Africa, Zambia and beyond in South Africa, for instance, of different degrees of what I'm analyzing and writing about would apply to your adopted home, the country that you decide to study. So Global China has been in existence for 20 years. It's not just today. And what is Global China? I think Global China is more than these names of policies that Beijing is so skillful in ditching out and framing. It's like every now and then they have this advertising campaign with a very catchy title to name that campaign, and the world get fascinated. Not only would you find these titles, these campaign names, brand names in news stories, but also academics, many of them in the policy world or the IR world, they take these very seriously. You have tons of books adopting these names. But what I like to suggest is to get away from these policy talks. Otherwise we get, hijacked, our academic agendas get hijacked by these policy agendas. We should, I think, move to from policy to power analysis, and to get away from thinking China as a geographical entity, to deterritorialized China. And that's what Global China really signals, is this idea that China is very much a force, an actor outside of China on the global arena. So we should try to detect Chinese presence outside of China. And one powerful way, useful way, is to think in terms of power and try to identify the generic power mechanisms that China has used. And in this book, and as it applied to Hong Kong, I've identified, as Alf mentioned, 3 power mechanisms. These are generic power mechanisms that, by the way, the United States and other big powers have historically or are still using to exert their power and influence abroad. And so one of the distinct advantages of using power and thinking in terms of generic power methods and strategies is that we can compare how China has expanded itself outward to other countries that have done attempted similar global projects, but using economic statecraft in different ways, using different agents. And then we can compare how big powers expand globally, and not just to demonize China for the Belt and Road, because if you only look at Belt and Road, you can only point fingers at China. But if you think about economic statecraft and concessional loans, then we can point fingers at both China and the West and compare how they use economic statecraft and concessional loans differently. And structural adjustment and debt trap, they're comparable. We'll come to that later, but I'm still on the framework issue. And to think of power, using power to analyze global China instead of policy is very useful also because power is relational. And in the sense that we'll be necessarily asking questions that a policy lens would not necessarily ask. Questions of resistance, question of appropriating domination, adaptation to domination. These are consequences, reaction to a power relationship, in a power relationship. We'll be asking questions about actor, their interests, their capacity, their strategies. So it opens up a lot of questions that a sole focus on policy would not. And then, as I said, we will be compelled to do comparison because these power strategies are generic and China is not alone in using them, although it uses them in quite distinctive ways. Okay, so another important concept I sort of borrow from the existing economic history and political economy literature is the idea of double movement. We should think of global China as a double movement in the sense that, like Polanyi, commodification and counter movement, because global China is a power project where the Chinese state is in many ways using the market to achieve its goals. So the marketplace, like what Polanyi has analyzed, the marketplace is spreading to different corners of the world, different corners of different parts of our lives. And this time, as a force of commodification, it is driven by Chinese state interests, but nevertheless using the market. And as Polanyi has suggested to us, when the market spreads, and this one pushed by the Chinese state, it necessarily triggers societal responses. And this is exactly what we have been observing, triggering counter movements around the world. And so you can say global backlash against global China, but if you look at it through a Polanyian lens, it's just your standard double movement in different parts of the world reacting against China. But because of global China's specificity, maybe the reaction to this wave of commodification driven by China would also have distinct features. I think this is a big question that I hope more people will study. We need a lot of empirical cases to document the spread of global China and the different kinds of counter movements that have been emerging in response to global China in different places, as these are shaped by local political economic conditions. So that's the kind of conceptual framework that I try to set up in this book. And for this talk, because I think there's a kind of an African angle, African constituency among the audience. So, and to drive home the point that despite all the big differences, drastic differences between Hong Kong and Zambia, if you look through the lens of global China, the analytical lens, the different power mechanisms that I'll go into, you find the similarities, striking similarities between these two places. Hong Kong, you can't find a more different, two more different places than Hong Kong and Zambia, in Asia and Africa. One is Asia's financial center, the other has nothing to do with finance, or little to do with finance, is a commodity-driven economy. Copper. One is very affluent and global. The other is quite impoverished and landlocked. One is a semi-autonomous city under Chinese sovereignty. The other is an independent country with multi-party democracy. But what they share is, and after spending time in both places, I realized what they share in common is this global China as a force in shaping their development since the late 1990s. The timing is exactly the same. And that has nothing to do with Hong Kong or Zambia. It's everything to do with the impetus for China to go global. And I won't have time to go into that. We can discuss that in the discussion if people prefer. But let me go to global China from a power perspective. What are the mechanisms that China has deployed in Hong Kong, and as I will indicate, and as you all know, in Zambia, in Africa, South Africa, or in Southeast Asia, and around the world, even in Europe, Eastern Europe, mega infrastructure projects. You find that we have white elephant projects that serve no purpose, is designed to fail, is designed to make losses, is not designed to make profit, is mega infrastructure projects built by the same state-owned construction companies, state-owned contractors, as all those that you find all over the world, in South Africa and Zambia, in Southeast Asia. In Zambia, we've seen a lot concessional loans for infrastructure projects. Economic statecraft is what? It's a power mechanism that basically can be simplified as the use of economic means to achieve political or diplomatic goals cherished by the state, driven by the state, defined by the state. In Hong Kong, China has been buying up land. Now, land, Hong Kong is very small. Land is one of the most expensive in the world. For many years, as a homeowner, it takes 20 plus years for a regular citizen to own a home, a tiny little apartment for 20 years without eating. All your income goes to saving for the home without eating, without paying for anything. It will take 20 some years, and it's the highest, most unaffordable city in the world. And China comes in to buy up land. It has become the major buyer, the developers from China. Basically, it's 100% Chinese now. In the past, we have Japan, people from Japan, local tycoons, and from Britain, from everywhere. You can invest in, you can come and buy very expensive land in Hong Kong. Now, right now, it's all China. And in real estate, and of course, Chinese SOEs investing, becoming the major component of the Hong Kong stock market. In Zambia, what is the most important sector in the economy? Copper. So Chinese SOEs heavily investing in copper. The second mechanism, China is not only trying to project its influence and power by economic means. Patron clientelism is a very, very major vector of Chinese power that I think is quite unique. It's not totally unique, but quite unique, because the Chinese have a whole machinery doing it. And in China, it's called the United Front. And it has gone global. The United States Congress has a whole long report about how the United Front, actually is the title, how the United Front has gone global. Patron clientelism, as the term implies, political scientists have studied for many years, is the exchange, unequal exchange of material rewards and benefits for political allegiance and for political support. And in Hong Kong, it has gone on for many years. It's intensified in the past 20 years as China needs to go abroad. And it's the same in many places, and I'll talk about Zambia in a minute. At both the elite level and the grassroots level, in Hong Kong, we see the co-optation of all the tycoons who used to be co-opted into the British colonial regime. Now, the Chinese regime has co-opted them, giving them honorific titles, and positions in all the wide variety of political institutions in China, in mainland China, so that these guys with an honorific title can easily go into the Chinese market and make even more money. But it's the co-optation, giving them business opportunity in exchange for their political allegiance, so that in Hong Kong they would support pro-China candidates, pro-China parties, pro-China civil society. Direct grooming of pro-China political leaders. Whole new parties have emerged. People who've never dabbled in politics have become leaders and legislators with the support of Chinese money. And of course, this whole machinery of garnering votes. Same thing in Zambia and throughout Africa, the so-called prestige projects, those soccer stadiums that have popped up. They were built in the birthplaces of presidents and national hero. And again, to buy favor with the African elite or Southeast Asian elite, so that they would do the bidding for Beijing. And it is a personal, it's network capital using money, but it's people that China is targeting. And it happens, by the way, among us academics, not me, but Harvard people. The dean of Harvard will be given a lavish trip, everything paid for, and have access to visit very important exclusive sites, the military sponsored companies. And it's patron clientelism. These people come back to the US. I just recently encountered one, I won't name names, but he's a powerful person from Harvard. And he was telling me how convinced he is that Huawei, this giant everybody's attacking in the West, that everybody knows has deep ties with the Chinese military. He was telling me that no, it's nothing to do with the Chinese military. The West has bad-mouthing China is just a hoax to say that Huawei is part of the big. And I said, why? What's your evidence? He said he has toured this place and was totally taken and convinced by the owner who gave him a personal tour. So, I mean, this is a very obvious, and he's not alone. I've seen so many people. We academics are not immune to this strategy, very effective strategy, because we're all human. We like to be put on a, to be worshipped and considered important. Anyway, I've digressed. I've many of these kind of stories. Campaign donation. Particularly when I was in Zambia, I was very close to the Patriotic Front. I saw from the inside how that works with the political elite when Sata and Guy Scott were in power. Anyway, in Hong Kong, patron clientelism works very aggressively at the grassroots. It's not just the elite that got absorbed into this network of patron clientelism. It's also the grassroots, ordinary, elderly people, working class people, particularly the working class people and the elderlies. They got a lot of financial sponsorship to do a lot of activities like badminton, calligraphy, Tai Chi, you name it. And they have personal young people who were a part of the network of community organization to take care of them, drive them to banquets, drive them to visit clinics to get their pulse checked, all these very personal services at the community level. And when election comes, of course, these people would vote for pro-China candidates. Now in Zambia, patron clientelism didn't get that deep because there was no grassroots for the Chinese to penetrate. So between just on this dimension of patron clientelism, Chinese power goes deeper in Hong Kong than in Zambia. And I'll come back to this point later. There's a big reason why. And of course, the election machine, as I said. Zambia, I haven't observed that because there's no grassroots for Chinese to penetrate. Symbolic domination is the third power mechanism that you see China using in Hong Kong, in Zambia, in Africa, and everywhere else in the world to different effect. As I said, if you look at it as a power project doesn't always succeed. It can get derailed, it can fail. And so we shouldn't for a minute assume that China, because China has an ambition to be powerful, that China is therefore necessarily becomes powerful. Symbolic domination, as we all know to this audience, is a kind of power process and a kind of power that works through the construction, the naming, and the classification of reality through symbolic forms that shape how reality is perceived, is constructed, is classified, is named, and how reality is naturalized and taken for granted. And usually it's through media and education system, through the writing of history, through textbooks, and so on and so forth. And in Hong Kong, we see this for 20 years. China has gradually taken ownership stakes in all the major mass media, both print and electronic, in school curriculum, different forms in shaping what young school children are reading. National education history, particularly, is a very contested terrain. The most recent historical truth that is now being taught in Hong Kong's classrooms is that Hong Kong has never been a colony. I mean, everybody was taken aback, but it's rewritten. Hong Kong history is being rewritten as we speak. That is defying all our common sense. The new history in Hong Kong is that Hong Kong has never been a colony, because the reason is because China has never recognized unequal treaties, and therefore, from the Chinese point of view, Hong Kong has never been a colony. Hong Kong has always been under Chinese sovereignty, but it was given to China has allowed Britain to govern Hong Kong. And in that sense, according to Chinese understanding, that's not a colony. Anyway, and we've seen for 20 years censorship, gradual censorship on school teachers and controlling professional credentials, punishing teachers who step out of line. In Zambia, well, again, it's not as deep. In Zambia, symbolic domination comes in a form of donation of medical clinics, dispatches of medical teams, and Confucius Institute, of course, teaching Mandarin in secondary schools since 2020, I was told. And of course, when you fly in airlines in Africa, you often come across free supplements on China in major newspapers, but also in those magazines that come for free reading. And if you pay attention, they're supplements, and they're provided by Chinese news agencies and always pitch a Chinese perspective of the world. And more recently, this Chinese company, I was told, very powerful and influential in Africa, Star Times, goes digital, is major partner with a national broadcaster to digitize local television. And if you pay for that service, it comes for free again, Chinese soap opera and Chinese programming, again, contents that are from China, shaping our dispositions, our feelings and views about China in a very inconspicuous, innocuous kind of way. And that's symbolic domination. Okay, so that is the power side. Let me take a look at time. That's the power side, how China tries to project its power. And the point I want to make by bringing Zambia into the discussion is to show that Hong Kong is not alone and in being the recipient of global China's impact, the impact of global China. And in Hong Kong in the past 20 years, and the reason why it has become a city of protest, whereas before it was just a city where people make money, it is because of this avalanche of influences from China and projects from China, attempts of China to influence and shape local society through the three mechanisms. By the way, those three are not exhaustive of other means of influence. It's just the three that are most salient in places that I have studied. And because of that, Hong Kong became a city of protest, trying to resist and China, and that's the counter movement story. And you can see here, 2019 was just the latest episode in a long history, long because it's 20 years long, and it coincides exactly with the period when global China began its work, and it has become recognized as a global force. The timing is a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. It exactly matches how these movements have emerged. I can go into any of them, but basically you can see it. They were targeting, like this textbook thing is targeting China's symbolic domination. And this is in this campaign that the world and us came to see Joshua Wong, this teenager, very flamboyant and very powerful teenage political leader, who is now in jail for his role in 2019. But he emerged as a political persona, political leader fighting against China. And he's just one person representing the whole generation of Hong Kong citizens in the post 1997 generation. 1997 was the time when the UK handed over sovereignty over Hong Kong to China, and people born around that time and after, I call them the post-colonial generation, and they were at the front line, like Joshua Wong, and those who were younger than Joshua Wong, they were at the front line of all these protests. And of course, other people joined them, but they were like the most radical, and they provide the energy for the fight against China. But Hong Kong is not alone. In Zambia, not exactly the kind of mass movement that we have seen, but the counter movement against global China in Zambia took other forms. As I said, counter movement encompasses a wide range, a spectrum of reaction, not necessarily street protest of 2 million. In Zambia, as I've studied, it took the form of mine worker strikes. Strikes against Chinese mines were longer, more frequent than mines that are not owned by the Chinese. I've documented that in the Specter of Global China book for a number of reasons I don't want to go into. And on the politician level, reaction against China is not necessarily resisting the presence of China, but taking the form of politicians leveraging anti-Chinese sentiment among the voters, leveraging that in election, fuel resource nationalism to make China concede in Zambia. And the Chinese concession in Zambia took the form of building 2 Chinese special economic zones in Zambia that help to fulfill elite vision of development for the Zambian elite. Way before China came to the scene, the elite version of development for the Zambian elite was industrialization and special economic zones like those you find in Asia. And so for years, they've been asking Malaysia, they've been asking Japan to build them economic zones. Nobody took any interest, and they leveraged the Chinese presence to make the Chinese build them the first 2 overseas economic zones in Zambia. And that was, for me, a counter movement, trying to embed, really the Polanyian sense of embedding capital to make it serve social national purpose. And in this case is the building of those special economic zones. And I go look at the processes whereby these zones came about. And it was not, as most people imagine, imposed on Zambia. It was the result of Zambian elite leveraging resource nationalism and make them build those so that they have a chance to turn copper ore into copper product, industrialization of copper. And of course, another way of looking at counter movement in Zambia is how opposition elite would use election of, again, running on anti-Chinese rhetoric to use elections to destabilize those established patron-clientelist relations. So what I'm suggesting here is that having, all these patron-clientelism strategy at work doesn't mean China succeeds. It could derail and destabilize the Chinese presence. As we see in many places, every time there's an election, the new ruling party may not recognize previous treaties, or they would renegotiate the Chinese presence. And that means patron-clientelism could lead to destabilization of Chinese power. On the ordinary level, the presence of Confucius Institute doesn't mean China can shape people's view about China. Some empirical research has been done to show that Zambians or Ethiopians participating, going to the Confucius Institute, the result of what? The result is not that they become convinced that Chinese culture is superior to Western culture or their own culture. They were going there just to learn Chinese because there are more employment opportunities once you know Mandarin. And so it's not the kind of soft power that China has aimed for when setting up these Confucius Institute. They didn't get soft power. They get a whole bunch of people trying to make use of Confucius Institute to learn the language for their own employment opportunities. So here I say here in the book, I looked at Hong Kong, go into the detail of what fuel and what make possible these movements against global China. But at the end, I also mentioned that, in other places, there are counter movements taking other forms because the local political economic dynamics are different. And so the counter movements would look different, but they are counter movements through the lens of double movement. If we look at global China as double movement, you'll see these parallels. Okay, let me conclude. I've said that despite the differences, we see the same bundle of power mechanisms deployed by China and a similar reaction in the different forms of counter movements. And what is interesting when you put these two together is that Chinese domination is more sweeping and goes deeper in Hong Kong than in Zambia. And resistance in Hong Kong is also stronger. Resistance to China is also stronger in Hong Kong than resistance in Zambia. Resistance is so strong, as I indicated in my first slide, that China is sort of compelled to react with a full-scale institutional transplant, with a full-scale colonization. Institutional transplant is my definition of colonization. It has and it is still doing, destroying all the previous institutions, whether we're talking about election, legislature, judiciary, the professions, the media, the rule of law, education system. All these major institutions of Hong Kong have been uprooted and replaced by Chinese communist institutions. And this, to me, is what exactly colonization has always been. And now it's happening to Hong Kong. So we're seeing global China taking the form of colonization, or if you will, internal colonization in Hong Kong, but not in Zambia, where there has been so much talk about Chinese neocolonialism or Chinese colonialism in Africa. That's the Western lens. It never happens. It has happened, I would say, only in Hong Kong so far. The reason is why. The reason is because of sovereignty. Now, sovereignty is not what most Marxists would think as important in determining the shape of colonialism or neocolonialism. The theory has always been that political independence does not guarantee you an exit from colonialism, because economic dependence will still haunt a politically independent Africa. But in this case, in the 21st century, when African countries, Southeast Asian countries have all gained independence. When you have a new power with colonial aspiration, sovereignty, as in the case of Zambia, sovereignty is still very important in pushing back, in derailing, in curbing this new colonial force that is global China. What the Hong Kong case shows, the extent to which China can come in and replace institutions and really install colonialism in Hong Kong is because of sovereignty. It has sovereignty over Hong Kong. It can do much, much more in reshaping and in uprooting Hong Kong than in a place like Zambia. Because with sovereignty, with elections, I don't see China doing much in penetrating that system, because sovereignty is not so easy to buy. There's still the people, there is still election, there's still opposition leaders. And that is something that we want to take seriously. China is trying to do colonialism in the 21st century, where it's already a world of independent state. And that is the curse for Hong Kong. In a world of independent nation states, Hong Kong is very difficult to resist. What can it be? It can't be a state. Nation state, Chinese sovereignty is still recognized by the international community. So decolonization of Hong Kong, which is how I'm framing my current book, to look at the past 20 years and even further back, Hong Kong is going through this struggle for decolonization, which is a total historical abnormality, because for the rest of the world, even Africa and Southeast Asian countries, decolonization has happened after the Second World War with the help of the United Nations, and the whole world was in a political climate where previous or former colonies have a legitimate ticket to decolonization, to independence. Hong Kong didn't. Hong Kong missed that opportunity. You know why? Hong Kong was originally, after the Second World War, was originally on the list of dependent territories en route to independence in that committee tasked with overseeing independence of dependent territories. Hong Kong was on that list, but once Beijing replaced Taiwan as the representative of China in the Security Council and a member of the United Nations, the first thing that China did was to maneuver to remove Hong Kong from that list. Successfully, Hong Kong was taken off from that list of dependent territories en route for independence. And since then, the international community basically blocked or refused Hong Kong the opportunity to become an independent territory. And then it didn't happen. There was no decolonization struggle. People didn't struggle to fight against British colonization. There was none. There was very little. There was some in the 60s, but since the 70s, there was nothing. And so the decolonization struggle happened in a totally different context. It happened when everybody else had attained independence in the 21st context, and the new colonial power happens to be China. But China has sovereignty, and we're still living in a world of nation state. So I think what the movement is, the decolonization movement is still alive, and in the diaspora, very much alive. We're still trying to find a way. People are still trying to find a way. In what form can we strike for decolonization? If not in a form of nation state, because that has been taken by the Chinese regime. But it's still a colonization project, because guess what? China is using race as the excuse, as the ideology to dominate Hong Kong. The rhetoric is, we're Chinese. You Hong Kong people are Chinese. And you should then subject to us, we, Beijing, as the representative of the Chinese people. And thus, that racialized nationalism is exactly why I see Hong Kong's struggle against China as a struggle against colonization, because after all, what is colonization? In the past, in history, as well as what is now fashionable in the US academia, talking about decolonizing the world, decolonizing the US academia, Western social science, is about race. And by the way, China is using the race card in Hong Kong, although in a way different from the West. It's not the white race dominating the Black or other colored people. It's the Chinese dominating people who are ethnic Chinese, but don't want Chinese racialized nationalism, don't recognize China as the nation, but has nowhere to go because the international community forces Hong Kong to recognize, to be part of the Chinese nation with a headquarters in Beijing. So I want to stop here and just open up this question. I hope you people who know more about colonization and decolonization in Africa and Southeast Asia, perhaps, to help me think through this project I'm still writing, this longer book I'm writing. And I'm struggling with how to make Hong Kong relevant to the 21st century world, especially to the current state of our academia, where everybody, strangely, in the US and I think in the UK too, is talking about decolonizing ourselves, academic mind, while people I study, ordinary people I study in Hong Kong, are struggling for real decolonization. It's a real political project. And we are talking about it in a way that seems to be quite detached from the people I'm studying. But we're still talking about decolonization. So decolonization is definitely a framework that I should make people care about what has happened and still happening in Hong Kong. And then so the Hong Kong story is very interesting on different registers, not just as a frontier of what it tells us about China and the global backlash against China taking different form, but also is a 21st century case, the only case, or maybe the last case in the world of a major colony struggling for what the people see as decolonization struggle, but not recognized by the rest of the world. The rest of the world recognized Hong Kong's struggle as a struggle of a city, of a global city, liberal, democratizing city against authoritarian, communist, sovereign, tyrannical, sovereign. It is that way that people see it, not as a case of decolonization, which many other societies have experienced and have a legitimate end game, which is the nation state. I think the challenge for the Hong Kong decolonization struggle is, what is the end game that is recognized as legitimate by other people? Thank you.
Thank you very much, CK.
Let me stop sharing.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, CK. That was a very rich and engaging presentation. I certainly appreciated the comparative angle with your work on Zambia, and indeed, it's always a privilege to get the author's perspective on their book or their books, especially when the text in question is as urgent as and topical as yours is. So I wanted to start off my comments by pointing out, what I think is a particular strength of this book, which is that it offers its readers two very important forms of insight at the same time. So on the one hand, you provide us with an incredibly substantive, astute, and insightful analysis of Hong Kong as a flashpoint for global protests against authoritarianism. As we all know, the 2010s was a decade of protests across the world, and authoritarian regimes of different hues faced strong opposition across different sites in the world system, from North Africa and Western Asia, via Ukraine and Sudan to India, and more recently, so we've seen strongman rulers and autocratic regimes being challenged on the streets, and Hong Kong is as you've argued, a keynote in this awful protest. So for anyone interested in understanding the dynamics of these kind of protests that have been so significant over the last decade, I mean, my take is that this book is, truly valuable in terms of what it offers us in terms of insights and so on. Now, on the other hand, I think the book is important because it offers a significant lens through which to view and reflect on the nature of ongoing transformations in the world system. So I'm thinking here, of course, of India's rise as an economic and geopolitical force to be reckoned with. And to a large extent, because of China's rise, also the crystallization of a more multipolar world order in which emerging powers from the global south arguably play a more vocal and assertive role than in the recent past. Now, this process is very often read in reductive ways. You've sort of alluded to that yourself in your talk and certainly in your book. And very frequently, also at very high levels of abstraction, what we get is a portrait of a process in which a China-led global south is squaring off against a US-led global north. Now, those readings are in turn also far too often shaped and informed by reductive political stances, in which China's rise is either seen as heralding ominous threats of less democratic futures, or alternatively as signaling an emancipatory turn for the global south in the world system. So what your book does, I think, is to complicate those kind of reductive bird's eye view readings of the Hong Kong situation by calling our attention to the counter movements spawned by China's expansionism and the oppositional imaginaries that these movements generate in and through their collective action, imaginaries about rights, about belonging, about community, and about democracy that can't easily be forced into simplistic geopolitical mappings of the present moment in world history. So in this sense, then I find this to be a book that can also be read as an implicit invitation to a more informed debate about the workings of the world system in the current turbulent and perilous, I think, conjuncture. Now, in picking up on that implicit invitation that I read into your text, I have three questions that I want to raise for discussion. Firstly, and of course you've done a lot of that already in your presentation, but I'm wondering if you could reflect further on how China's strategy of global expansion as is played out in the context of Hong Kong with the modalities that through which it has been enacted, how that generally compares with China's expansion elsewhere. That is, to what extent can we apply the insights that your book offers on the dynamics of China's outbound deployment of power in relation to Hong Kong to thinking about similar outbound deployment of power in the context of the Global South more generally? Secondly, I have a question that's rooted in my strong interest in the field of social movement research. So one of the things that I found so impactful about your book is that in the space of a mere 75 pages, you managed to outline and interrogate a 2-decade-long movement process with a keen eye to details in terms of how Hong Kong's decolonization movement has developed and changed in terms of strategy, tactics, and missions. A question that then emerges for me is whether this trajectory can reasonably be understood as a process of collective learning in which activist collectives have gradually honed their repertoires of contention and their oppositional political project to contest the tightening of China's grip on Hong Kong more adequately. Now, if it can, and this brings me to the questions that you raised in the very last paragraph of the book, then a related question would be what you think might be likely future trajectories of that process of activist learning, if it manages to overcome its current hiatus and the strong headwinds of autocratization and right-wing nationalism that are currently shaping, politics in far too many places in the world. My third and final question pertains to the extent to which the Hong Kong situation can be considered a bellwether in terms of what lies ahead for global China. That is the Chinese state project of expansion in the world. I'm wondering whether the kind of turbulence we've seen in the context of Hong Kong, grounded in a legitimacy crisis of the global China project in that specific site, is likely to be repeated elsewhere, and again, particularly in the global south? If so, I also wonder how you think such turbulence might impact on and also be impacted by the so-called new Cold War that is unfolding between the US and China presently. So I'll stop there. I'll hand back to CK to respond to those comments, and then we'll open it up for questions and from the participants more generally. So back over to you again, CK.
Okay, can I suggest that I have noted down your 3 questions, and should we get a sense of whether our audience have similar questions? Then and then I can come back to.
Sure, that's fine, entirely fine.
As a first round involved.
Yeah, should we? So the floor is open for questions. Tula has his hand up. Tula, do you want to come in?
Hi, I just want to, hi everybody. I just want to unmute everything and get everything properly accessed. Right, my question is, how Marxist are these appeals to the global Chinese community? What role does Marxism play? Is it completely obsolete, or does it still play a role in mobilizing global China? And if the appeals are purely nationalist, does national pride at China's undoubted achievements since the late 1970s not have any resonance within the Hong Kong community? Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Tula. Is there anyone else who'd like to raise a question right away to help us get the discussion going? You can put up your hand, or if you're feeling shy, you can put your question in the chat box also.
Well, while people are thinking, coming and formulating questions, I can answer some of these existing ones. Let me begin with Tula's. Very, very interesting questions. Marxism, I think it's been for 40 years, 30 years at least, that Chinese people on the mainland, let alone in Hong Kong, ordinary people have really taken Marxism seriously. They had to deal with it because it is part of the compulsory, mandatory general education in Chinese universities. And you get, every day you still open people's daily or listen to news in CCTV. They got recited, they got quoted, but nobody really take them seriously because they know that it's just pure rhetoric. And so Marxism is alive in a very rhetorical sense, and in a sense that doesn't really have any symbolic leverage, because it fails to persuade, it fails to penetrate people's disposition, it fails to shape their worldview, it fails to classify, name, and naturalize the world reality. Respond to your first question. Now, the second question, you said, well, China has been so successful, and Hong Kong really is in the front line in the sense that Hong Kong has always been the bridge for foreign capital, global capital to come in. They want to access the Chinese market, they always go through Hong Kong. And Hong Kong has benefited a lot from that middleman kind of role. The financial hub, its status as financial hub, has a lot to do with this serving, serving the West, going into the Chinese market, the financial institutions and stock market, as well as the other way around, which is Hong Kong is the place where 80% of China's companies, state-owned, privately owned, is the place where these Chinese companies raise their IPOs, capitalize to find capital. So Chinese economic development in the past decades should have make many people happy and should have sort of damped their spirit of resistance. So the question, answering your question, why were Hong Kong people not happy with being in such a front row seat position to take advantage, to grow their wealth when this market opens up? They did. A lot of people make a lot of money, and the whole society got very affluent. But that's why from the very beginning, I focused on the youngsters, the people who came of age after 1997, who are still teenager, or like Joshua Wong, he's only, I think this year he's 25. But when he began, he was a teenager. That is the post-colonial generation. That post-colonial generation, they haven't grown to a stage where they could take advantage of the China market. On the other hand, quite the contrary, they were born into the freest city on earth, having enjoyed rule of law. Before China messed things up, that's their Hong Kong. That is why they gave their lives to protect, because they didn't know a colonial Hong Kong like the one I grew up and got influenced by colonial hegemony. They just felt that they were born to be masters of their own city, and that Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong is actually the official slogan that the British and the Chinese leaders have preached to us, sold us this idea of one country, two systems. And so for the young people, the younger generation, which is the major force, 80–90% of them identify themselves as Hong Kongers. For them, that opening up was nothing, because that coming in of China meant to them freedom is being taken away. Beijing represented the opposite of freedom, and freedom was what these young people wanted more than what the economic system can offer them. And by the way, Hong Kong's economy has been going so unequal that even the middle class are not benefiting much from it. The high land prices, unless you're developers or real estate tycoons, you don't actually benefit. So that's the way a lot of people in Hong Kong see it, is red capitalism. Red capitalism does not benefit Hong Kong people. Red capitalism discriminates against Hong Kong people because of the many Chinese state-owned enterprises, big companies now, global Chinese companies, setting up branches in Hong Kong. Guess what? There's a glass ceiling for local professionals. They don't trust them. The bosses from China, they don't trust local Hong Kong people because they saw them as different. These are not real. I mean, I have been looked at by many mainland Chinese as not real Chinese because I was born and raised in Hong Kong. On the other hand, they use Chinese nationalism, racialized nationalism as the reason to rule us and say you should be loyal to us. Anyway, so that's I hope I answered that question of why Hong Kong people are not that happy with China, this big market. Should I take more questions before go, because I see more hands?
Yeah, we'll invite the folks with their hands up here. So Carl first, then we're moving on to Christian, and then we're moving on to Bjorn. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay, Carl, go for it.
Hi, Carl.
Hi, CK. Nice to see you. Yeah, I'm okay. I'm in Cape Town though, which is the other end of the country. But it's wonderful to see you and wonderful to hear about another fantastic book, which I'm really looking forward to reading in the next few weeks. Well, as you know, in the project that the three of us are working together, this question of global China becomes a really, really important one, and I was really interested in the light that you shed on that. My question is, what do you think China is seeking to achieve through, its increasing global strength and control and power across the world? I mean, in a certain sense, one's familiar. I mean, in a very, very reductive way. US domination, world domination has got a very economic base. It's a lot to do with profit making. China, as you've pointed out, a lot of its investments, a lot of the Belt and Road and other kinds of engagements in different countries is not really about profit. And so I'm kind of curious about how we think about China's increasing power on the world stage, increasing challenge to the US, I suppose, to US domination, but more broadly as well. Where is it seeking to go with this? Or is it, yeah, that would be my question.
Yeah, I think
Thanks.
that dovetails with Elf's third question that I'll respond to later. But should we collect the other two?
Yeah, I think so. Let's move on to Christian, and after Christian, just come straight in, Bjorn.
Oh, thank you very much also for this great presentation. I have one comment and one question. And you were talking about colonization as institutional transplant. And I think that's very convincing, but might it be only one of the mechanisms of colonialism? Because I thought maybe land acquisition would also be something important to look at here. You shared with us what was happening in Hong Kong, and I looked into how copper mines in Zambia started, and land acquisition was right at the beginning of this colonial process. So maybe that's something that might offer you another way to compare these two cases. And the question, my question is, and I'm asked this question many, many times, how do we deal with global China? So when I take your last slide, I learned that strengthening sovereignty might be a pathway, especially for countries like Zambia that have to deal with a multitude of Chinese actors, and where the state doesn't have the capacity to deal with all this. So that would be my question for you. What can we do about it? Yeah, and getting from a reaction to maybe an initiative to change things. Yeah.
All right, straight on to Bjorn.
We can't hear you.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to read your book. I'm going to go out and buy it right now.
You don't have to buy, you just download. It's free.
Oh, it's I was a bit late in the beginning, so that's great to know. But one of the questions, when I've done similar work in Zimbabwe, and one of the interesting things I noted, just for a comment quickly before the question, is everybody thinks they're the good guy. Everybody thinks that they are doing some kind of good work in the world often, and has all these justifications. So I was wondering, you know, in what ways do you think we can identify people that we can bring to the table to have conversations about the future of China's role? And then the second question I have is, what in your perception, when you talk about United Front work, what is your perception of the role of party organizations and enterprises overseas, and how powerful are they in directing and coordinating the various actors? Is there any coordination amongst different party organizations in enterprises and other overseas Chinese actors? Thank you.
All right, thanks very much, everyone. We'll hand over to CK. That's a pretty full plate.
I have tons of great questions to choose from. Maybe I should go to pick up this. Okay, a shorter response to a shorter question first. The United Front question. You're right. United Front agents and machinery is in every, I would say, every major Chinese company, private or state-owned, because there's a rule that anytime you have, I think it's 25 Communist Party members, the Communist Party makes you set up a branch, whether it's a school, hospital, or anything. So, and also, I mean, many of you might have heard that even like grocery stores around the corner, they're now being co-opted, they're being used as police stations, doing weird things, surveillance activities for the government. And this is something that has created a lot of controversy and alert in the US and Canada and Australia and the UK too. On university campuses, my students, visiting scholars, undergraduates, PhD students, the embassies call on them all the time, some more aggressively than others. They have an association that provides is a front of an association for students and scholars, but actually, again, doing United Front work. And there is also increasing evidence about transnational repression. So it's not so much that these people who are outside of China, they'll get hurt, they'll get arrested. They might, but it's not the usual situation. The usual situation is they hold their friends and families back in China hostage. It's like they would be told, these students and visitors to the West, saying that if you don't do this and that, your parents at home, they will lose their job, or they'll be kicked out of their residence, things like that. So transnational relational repression is very active. So now, to what extent do the different units of United Front machinery work together or against each other? Is always there's no one fixed answer. They could undermine each other. They will work against and contradict each other, and so there's always some unpredictable outcome. But I think, by and large, what we need to understand is, why do people on the ground would cooperate with the United Front agenda, and to try to get their concerns in the open, and try to address what make these people, even though they're in the West, they would still do the bidding for Beijing. Now, a lot of them would be after material interest, but a lot of them also have no choice, because they have hostages back home. The regime can hold hostages back home. So I think we need to figure out how United Front works. Sometimes it's, as I said about this Harvard dean, he's just a vanity. His vanity is enough. I mean, I don't think he would need any particular material incentive. And other times it's really nationalism. Don't forget that the Chinese are very strong, and a lot of people buy them, particularly if you grew up on the mainland. They were fed and indoctrinated from kindergarten up. And the first reaction is they don't trust people in the West. They don't trust Western media. They don't trust Western scholars. There's this almost basic assumption. Symbolic domination really works if you grew up in China. So I think the United Front requires a lot more research for us to understand when it fails, when it succeeds. But it's a very shadowy, a shady and shadowy, opaque kind of institution that would require a very shrewd researcher to really break open that black box. Okay, I like to go to the land is of course a very important dimension of it. How to deal with global China, and where is global China heading? I think all of the three of you asked similar questions. I would like to say this. China, we talk about China as China, but at least for me, based on my knowledge about China, I think Xi Jinping himself is one big factor, just what goes on in this guy's mind and his own personal agenda. But the mastermind of global China doesn't reside only in Xi Jinping. He's basically driven by politics. He's driven by basically like Putin. Now, who can constrain Putin? I think these guys have very much in common, not just the political economic situation that they find themselves in, the kind of power that they have amassed and concentrated in himself, but their ambition. My very esteemed colleague, Michael Mann, he was talking to me one day. He said that, he was looking through some historical documents. He really said that Xi Jinping thinks like an emperor. And increasingly, I mean, I have to believe that he has that mentality in the sense that he was so adamant about China's position in the world, and he himself as the representative, that the guy that represents his glory and position in history. He is behaving like an emperor, greedy for power and honor and recognition on the world stage. But I don't think he's the only mastermind. He's not, he may play a big role. Knowing China, I would always reject that there is one single mastermind in China gas, because what? Because you just look at the Belt and Road. If you go inside the Belt and Road machinery, you will see so many ministries, so many provincial governments, party leaders, provincial governments, many different kinds of departments, policy banks, and different varieties of state-owned enterprises. They all have corporate interest, organizational, bureaucratic interest, departmental interest in this Belt and Road. That's why we see Belt and Road failing in the sense of investing in failing projects, because they were never economically sound projects in the long run. And they never serve China's national interest. But in the short run, they make a lot of money, and growth rate for these corporate interest, departmental interest, and universities, you know, getting funding. And so in the short run, so Kyle's question, are they making money or not making money? State-owned enterprises, they have to make certain money, but also have the political agenda to build state power. But there are many actors in the system, including the banks that loan to state-owned enterprises. They are there to make a quick buck, but also have to convince the state that some of the projects will serve China's long-term political interest, so that the copper business doesn't have to respond to rise and fall of copper prices, because it's in China's long-term state interest to secure copper as source. Now that reveals certain logic of state capital, which I wrote in the book. But there are other actors who are purely driven by, and they were not being restrained or regulated, because is the government regulating their own state-owned enterprise? They can't do, they fail to do. And there's banks. I mean, regulation, yes, for private industries, but not for state-owned enterprise. So where's global China heading? I think nobody will know, not even Xi Jinping himself can determine, because he's sitting on top of a massive machinery where there are a lot of people fighting against each other and have their own organizational, personal interest. That's why this crackdown on billionaires, because as we speak, billion and billion of Chinese money is going outside the country. And that's why catching these guys is not about these guys' corruption. It's about stopping an outflow, an exodus of Chinese capital that China has no way of controlling. And China's economy is in deep trouble. And that's the answer, or not answer, but response to where global China is going. People are now seeing that China is not as powerful as we all assume, or most people assume it to be, because, you know, just a while ago, people were just so mesmerized by the huge dollar sign, the amount of money that China is throwing around the world, and we think the whole world is going to be taken by China. Guess what? Those projects never end, never finish. Those rails, many of them have been abandoned. There's a Financial Times piece that I often point to. Those many more projects have been abandoned or end up in losses than those successful ones, which end up in debt trap, trapping, and debt traps hurt China as well. They have to cancel those debt. Otherwise, the whole world would be blown up in unrest and people protesting against China. So China is, I would say at this point, first of all, internally they're divided. Xi Jinping is going off the trail and pursuing his political agendas to the extent that it would risk destroying Hong Kong. Now, destroying Hong Kong is a very telltale sign of the problems of China. if China stays rational, it would never have done so much to destroy a city that used to be so capitalist and care nothing about politics. It turns it into a very politicized city, but exactly because it's not rational. And the irrationality comes from, I think, Xi Jinping. But he is not in control of the whole thing because of all these departmental ministerial conflicts. And so he's losing control of his own people and losing control of his own economy because it has overreached. Susan Shirk's book about overreaching, China overreaching. And political overreach means, like in Hong Kong, it destroys one of its most important source of capital and technology to China to fuel China's rise. So it's throwing stone at its own feet because of its political ambition. So you have, I hope I'm portraying this, this unsuccessful China. And so I think there's backlash against China, but China's own missteps from the top is creating a blowback at its own economy, undermining its economy. Now, if Chinese economy is undermined or in jeopardy, to what extent will it be able to sustain the United Front global machine? To what extent can it still dish out those perks to create loyalty, to buy loyalty? To what extent can it still use economic stagecraft as a power mechanism? To what extent can it still invest in CGTV, which is this global TV network? I mean, the Chinese economy within is very scary right now. I mean, maybe somebody should invite somebody who knows better than I about the Chinese economy. I can see it is in a deep crisis, and destroying Hong Kong is just going to deepen its crisis. And so if Chinese economy within China is in deep trouble, is global project, the Global China project, will be in deep trouble because it depends a lot on Chinese capital. And on top of that, we have all these counter movements that I described. People appropriating, elite appropriating or pushing back at Chinese agenda, and ordinary people like in Hong Kong resisting it. So global China, the backlash against global China is one force from the outside, but the collapse and maybe the crisis of the Chinese economy from within may be the bigger trouble and will have bigger impact in shaping global China down the road, because global China originated from bottlenecks, tensions and crisis, legitimacy and accumulation crisis within. So now that origin, that impetus is in crisis. So we'll be seeing ripple effect around the world. I think we are time's up.
Well, I see this. Bjorn has his hand up again, so I'm going to let him sneak in one last question. I think he's also nodding very vigorously here. So yeah, coming back in, Bjorn.
Sorry, I was just very interested. The CCP says that through discipline, party discipline, they're able to maintain good governance, and I see you laughing at that. How would you, if you could just give us a last comment about how you would imagine the inability, or could you frame the inability of the CCP to enforce, or how does it enforce party discipline abroad? That's very interesting to me.
Okay, I have a very quick and very apt response to that, and very quick. The correct way to get at the truth, the correct way to read communist propaganda is to read it the other way around. So, and that will get you the truth. It's very simple formula. If it says we have discipline outright, and the more they repeat it, the more the truth will be the opposite of it. And that is the lack of discipline. So it's a false question if you're asking, how do they enforce discipline? When they emphasize that they have the discipline to carry out Xi Jinping's project or policy, that means they don't. And the more they emphasize it, the more it suggests that they are failing. So that's my response.
All right, thanks, CK. I think we can wrap there. I think thanks to CK for a wonderful presentation about a very, very important book. Like I've mentioned before, It is available as a soft copy, open access, and the link is there in the chat box. While you're at it, those of you who are interested in Global China Matters, check out the series that is a part of. I've just, over the past weeks, I've been through 3 of the books myself, and they are fantastic. So knock yourselves out on that. CASA has another webinar coming out next week, where we'll be looking at the agrarian question in contemporary India. Courtesy Shrishti Yadav, who's a very exciting young researcher who's working out of Asim Premji University in Bangalore. So we look forward to that. And I think we might already have a link ready for anyone to sign up. It's in the chat box as well. Jason has posted it. So keep following us. Thanks for your participation today. Thanks for all the questions. Thanks very much to CK. I hope we'll see several of you again in future webinars. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alf.